Hello and welcome to the San Francisco Opera Guild's opera preview of El último sueño de Frida y Diego, a brand new co-commission from the Bay Area composer Gabriela Lena Frank and Pulitzer Prize winning playwright Nilo Cruz. Especially exciting is that this will be the company's first Spanish language opera. Performing as Frida Kahlo is Argentine soprano Daniela Mack, who we remember as both a former San Francisco Merola participant and an Adler Fellow, alongside Mexican baritone Alfredo Daza, who is also a former Adler Fellow and will play the role of famed muralist Diego Rivera. My name is Benjamin Osgood, and I serve on the board of directors for the San Francisco Opera Guild, whose award-winning education programs reach over 64,000 students annually in more than 215 schools. And tonight, we're so fortunate to have Lucy Caplan here with us to preview this exciting opera for us. Lucy is Assistant Director of Studies and a lecturer on history and literature at Harvard University, where she teaches classes on music, history, and culture. She's currently working on a book titled High Culture on the Lower Frequencies, African Americans and Opera in the Early 20th Century. Lucy's academic writing appears in the Journal of the Society for American Music, American Studies, and the collection African American Arts, Activism, Aesthetics, and Futurity. Her essays have been published in the New Yorker Online and Opera News, among others, and her program notes have been commissioned by Boston Lyric Opera, Santa Fe Opera, Seattle Opera, and Lincoln Center. Lucy holds a PhD in American Studies and African American Studies from Yale University. And we're just thrilled to have you here. How are you tonight, Lucy?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you?
Doing great. And I learned a fun fact about you. John and I learned that you just recently ran the Boston Marathon for the first time. How was that?
Oh, it was amazing. It totally lives up to the hype of running the Boston Marathon. Great crowds, great support. It was really, really fun.
That's amazing. Well, welcome back. That's such a huge accomplishment, and it's something that I know that I will never do. So hats off to you. So we do have a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you think of a question you want to ask Lucy or a comment you'd like to make during the preview, please use that. After the preview, John will curate all those questions and get them all together and have them answered for you. But tonight we're actually going to invite the audience to turn on their camera if you want. There's no obligation at the end, and we could have a live discussion as well. So it should be fun and interactive. So without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Lucy for tonight's opera preview of El último sueño de Frida y Diego.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Benjamin, for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much to everyone for tuning in tonight for this preview. I'm really thrilled to be here, and it's been such a pleasure this week to travel around the Bay Area and meet so many opera enthusiasts. So it feels extra special to be here. I was first in touch with the San Francisco Opera Guild in 2019 about the prospect of speaking about The Handmaid's Tale, which was scheduled to go up in 2020. We all know what happened then, so I was really sad not to be able to come out to talk about that piece, but it means that I'm really extra thrilled to be here this evening talking about a really fantastic new opera, El último sueño de Frida y Diego. So I'll go ahead now and share my screen so that we can see some slides related to this evening's talk. This is a piece that I'm especially excited to be speaking about tonight for a couple different reasons. So as Benjamin mentioned, I'm an opera scholar with a background in American studies and cultural history, which means that I'm really interested in these questions of how opera responds to and reflects and even maybe shapes the culture around it. And I think that this piece is a really excellent window into some of those questions. I'm also excited because it's a piece that foregrounds voices and stories that maybe aren't the ones that we always associate with opera, that really help us think about this art form as a living art form, as something that is changing and growing and has a really bright future ahead of it. And finally, and most importantly, I think this is just a really fantastic new piece of music and of theater. It's really layered and conceptually ambitious, and it has a lot to say about the role of the artist in our society. And it does all this through a really beautiful and unique musical language. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of that work with you this evening. So the preview that I will offer is in 3 parts. First, I will speak about the opera and its creators. I'll share some information about the composer and about the librettist, and also about their collaborative creative process in bringing this work to the stage. Next, I will zoom out a bit to speak about the subject of women's voices in contemporary opera, how we locate this piece within a broader tradition of works by women and works that represent women in the world of opera. And third and finally, we will look at a piece called The 5 Moons of Lorca, which is another collaboration by Gabriela Elena Frank and Nilo Cruz that I think gives us a really fantastic window into their collaborative creative style and their artistic partnership. And as Benjamin mentioned, there will be some time for questions at the end. If you think of a question along the way, please feel free to put it in the Q&A right away, and then at the end I'll be sure to address as many of those as I can. So let's get started. So The Last Dream of Frida and Diego is the very first opera written by the composer Gabriela Elena Frank and the librettist Nilo Cruz. It's a new work that premiered in San Diego this past fall in October of 2022, and the performances that are just about to start in San Francisco will mark the second production of this opera. We'll talk more later about what exactly happens in this piece, but for now, just suffice it to say that it is a kind of fantastical exploration of the relationship between Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera that has themes of art and passion and desire and liberation, and these are kind of the classic opera themes reimagined in a new setting here. And Gabriela Elena Frank, who you can see pictured here, is one of the most prominent American composers working today. She's currently composer in residence with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and she's received countless fellowships and awards. These range from a Guggenheim Fellowship to a Heinz Award to a Latin Grammy, and many more. Her music has been commissioned by performers who include Yo-Yo Ma, the Los Angeles Master Chorale, and the orchestras of Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, Atlanta, Cleveland, San Francisco, and more. She's originally from the Bay Area, from Berkeley, and she studied composition and piano at Rice University and the University of Michigan. So what I've just given you is kind of what we might think of as the official bio, something that you might read in the program or read in a kind of on her website when you get to know about a composer. But I also want to share a video in which Frank describes her own path to becoming a composer in somewhat different terms. And here you can notice what she chooses to highlight in this video where she narrates her path to deciding to become a composer.
Look at me, I don't look like most composers in classical music. I'm not white, I'm a woman, and I'm alive. Most composers that we think about, Beethoven, Mozart, they're not alive, right? And I'm hearing impaired. There are people that are amazed when I tell them that I was born with a hearing loss. And I wear hearing aids. The first time I was fitted with hearing aids was when I was 5 years old. For the first few years of my life, I didn't speak. I vocalized strange sounds, but I really wasn't able to hear enough to be able to pick up speech. And when this was caught, I had just started kindergarten. Becoming a composer was definitely a step-by-step process. I was born with the ability. There's a music gene that's floating around on my father's side of the family. And I still hear stories about his mother and his uncle having the ability to sit down and compose at the piano. We normally call this improvisation,
But for me, it's a type of composing. I was known as the one in the house that could quickly extemporize from a tune that somebody might whistle at me, or repeat something I've heard from a Peruvian music concert that was quite an important part of my backdrop. When I began writing down the music and began thinking about composition as a career choice, a vocational path for me, was the summer before my last year in high school, when the San Francisco Conservatory, in its original location on Ortega Street, was advertising a music composition program for pre-college students. So I went ahead and I signed up for this, and overnight I changed everything. I saw prodigies for the first time, little kids playing piano and violin like nobody's business. And I realized that the ability to extemporize, having perfect pitch, was something that was a bit more perhaps unique. We do a good job in this country of finding performing talent, but perhaps pay less attention to those that are budding composerly talents. And I realized that I didn't see people that looked like me as well. Even in the multicultural and diverse San Francisco Bay Area, I didn't see a lot of Latinas that were in this conservatory environment. And I just had this instinct that the world needed me. They needed me to go into an environment that didn't represent multiracial, Latina identifying individuals like myself. So I had no idea what the life was going to be like, but I came home, I remember my heart was beating. I grew up in that day, and I told my parents this was something that I felt like I needed to do, and I had their support, and that's how I decided to be a composer.
So I think this video is really useful because it helps us think about various facets of Frank's experience and identity that maybe don't show up in a biography focused on accolades or accomplishments of hers, but that are really relevant to her work. Something that we hear in this video is this notion of identity as being really central to her sense of self and to the music that she creates. And in fact, if you go to Frank's website, you'll see that right at the beginning of the bio that she provides for herself, she writes, "Identity has always been at the center of composer and pianist Gabriela Elena Frank's music." And this means a bunch of different things. There are multiple facets to this. One is that her multicultural heritage is really important to the music that she creates and to how she thinks about what it means to be a composer. So she notes that she's inspired by figures like Bartók and Ginastera, and that she's traveled extensively through South America in a project of creative exploration. So her music reflects her own personal experience as a multiracial Latina person, but it also reflects these studies that she has of Latin American cultures, poetry, mythology, native musical styles. All of these things are part of what it means to her to compose in a Western classical framework. And this heritage also shaped her experience growing up in terms of what kind of music she had access to and what she heard. So we heard in the video that she had kind of a traditional conservatory education in the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, but she also listened to a whole lot of other music, including a great deal of South American folk music. That was one of the types of music that she would attend a lot of concerts of as a child. And she became really fascinated by points of convergence that she began to hear among these really disparate traditions. In an interview, she stated, in what I think is a really fascinating way, how she began to hear some of these convergences. So she says, and this is a quotation, "Paganini's caprices had always conjured up a hidden memory of the frenetic energy of Peruvian Cachua dances. Bach's contrapuntal lines jogged my mind for Andean duo panpipe tunes. Beethoven's stormy sonatas smacked of vibrating Bolivian huancara drums. Debussy's flute writing paralleled the melancholy Harawis of the Andes, and the list goes on. It didn't take long to realize that embers burned deep in my consciousness, unattended. The question was, what was I going to do about it?" So I really love this quotation because I think it does a really excellent job of showing us what it means to write music from a particular standpoint. This music, Paganini, Bach, Beethoven, Debussy, is all music that I know and love, but I would never come up with these specific references or points of convergence. And I imagine that everyone listening would have their own set of associations that they would bring to this work. So it's a really great example of how experience can shape what we hear. In the video, we also heard Frank speak about her experience of being hearing impaired and how that has affected her life, both within and beyond the project of being a composer. And a couple years ago, Frank wrote an essay for the New York Times that's a really great piece. I encourage you to read it if you have the chance, in which she talked about a few different things. One, she talked about Beethoven's music and how she could hear his experience of deafness kind of encoded into his music. Really, really interesting perspective. And she also talked about what it meant to her as a composer. So a few things that she wrote about that. One is that she wrote, if I don't wear my hearing aids for a couple days, my composing ideas start to become more introverted. This can produce music that is more intellectual, more contrapuntal, more internal, more profound, more spiritual, more trippy. And when I'm really under a deadline, she writes, and I need to get new ideas, I don't usually listen to music as some composers do. In fact, I do the opposite. I take off my hearing aids and stay in silence for a few days. In the absence of sound, my imagination goes to different places. It's a bit like being in a dream, when unusual and often impossible events come together, the perfect place from which to compose. And when I put in my hearing aids again, I can feel all these wonderful ideas and connections fly away, just as a dream disappears when awakening. So what I find interesting about both of these examples, one having to do with her experience of hearing impairment and the other having to do with her racial identity and cultural identity, is that Frank is telling us that she doesn't necessarily write music that is autobiographical or that's kind of about her life, but rather all the experiences that she has as a person, the way that she moves through the world, really fundamentally shape her intellectual interests, her musical interests, and her choices and craft as a composer. So there's a really kind of important sense here of what it means to write music from her specific vantage point. Frank is also active in a number of other endeavors beyond composition, and I want to mention a few of those as well. Most kind of saliently, she in 2017 founded an institute called the Gabriela Lena Frank Creative Academy of Music, and you can see some pictures from that here. She did this after making a cross-country drive in the summer of 2016, when she found herself really kind of discouraged at the anger and turmoil and divisiveness that she witnessed. And she wanted to do something about that using the work of composition. So what she did is founded this program that serves as essentially a mentorship program for young composers, and it's reached more than 70 participants thus far. And the program has a really wide range of activities. It pairs younger composers with more established performers and mentors. It offers them opportunities to get their work commissioned and performed. It encourages civic engagement, and that the participants often have the opportunity to work with local youth music programs and to engage with the community where they're based. And the program has a really strong commitment to climate activism. They're really interested in this question of how music can speak to and responsibly engage with questions surrounding the climate crisis. So this is another facet of Frank's identity, and one that's really been important to her over the last several years, as she's also been writing this opera, The Last Dream of Frida and Diego. So that brings us to another question, which is, what does this all sound like? We've heard now about her biography, about her identity, about what's important to her kind of on an intellectual level, but how does this work in the music that we hear? To start to answer that question, I'm going to turn first to a piece called Leandès, an Andean walkabout, which is one of Frank's most famous compositions. She wrote this in 2001, first for string quartet, later adapted it for string orchestra. And it was premiered by a group called the Chiara Quartet, and we'll hear their performance in a moment. So this is a piece that is in 6 short movements, and refers to various instruments and kind of concepts from the Andes. The first movement is called toyos, and the toyo is an Andean panpipe that you can see pictured here. It's a little bit hard to see scale in this picture, but the instrument is quite tall, probably around 5 feet tall, and a really large woodwind instrument that produces a really unique sound that's characterized by kind of a breathiness and accented beginning to the notes. So Frank writes program notes for many of her own compositions, and in the notes for this piece, she writes, Leyendas draws inspiration from the idea of mestizaje, as envisioned by Peruvian writer Jose Maria Arguedas, where cultures can coexist without the subjugation of one by the other. And as such, this piece mixes elements from the Western classical and Andean folk music traditions. She also writes that this piece is dedicated to her mother, who is Peruvian, and that is really important to the work that she does here. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but Frank's own background is that her mother is of Peruvian and Chinese descent, and her father is Lithuanian and Jewish, and she incorporates all of those elements into her music. This piece focusing on the kind of Peruvian component of her heritage. So we're going to listen to a few things now. We're first going to listen to this movement where Frank uses the traditional string quartet to evoke the sound of this instrument, the toyo. So this is a string quartet, 2 violins, viola, and cello, but making sounds that I think you'll hear are somewhat different from what we might typically associate with the string quartet. So here we'll listen to this now. So that is the movement of the quartet. And with that sound in mind, I'm now going to play a brief clip of what the toyo itself sounds like. So you can notice similarities and differences in the sounds of the quartet and the instrument itself. So here's that sound. So I think, as you can hear, there are really compelling similarities between these two, even as they make very different sounds. So how does Frank do this? How does she use the string quartet to create those sounds? I was really curious about this because I'm a string player myself, a violist, and I wanted to look at the score and know how she does this. And what I found is that she uses really kind of traditional techniques. So she's not asking the players to do anything really outside the realm of Western classical training. She's just using ideas really creatively to create this sound. So a couple of examples. She asked the players to use glissandi, or kind of sliding from note to note, rather than going one note, stop, and then the next. And that creates a more wind instrument-like sound. She also asks some of the players in the group to play further up on the fingerboard of the instrument to create a breathiness or airiness in the sounds, in the sound color. At the same time, though, she has other players in the group use pizzicato, or plucking the string, to create that sense of kind of an accented beginning to the note. And she also asks all the players to use a really wide vibrato, or oscillation of the pitch, to mimic the sound of this instrument. So, if you've ever played a string instrument, these are probably all really familiar concepts to you, things you think you could do pretty easily. And what I think is so interesting here is that she's really putting into practice the idea of mestizaje as she describes in the program notes, where these different practices are coexisting without one dominating the other. So let's listen to the movement again now that we've kind of pulled back the hood a little bit and know more about how she is evoking the sound of that instrument. Hear those glissandi slides there. And the pizzicato starts to mix as well. So the piece that we just heard really helps us understand some of the hallmarks of Frank's style as a composer. And these are hallmarks that carry through to the last stream of Frida and Diego. So I'll list just a few of those here, things to note about her style more broadly. One is that Frank uses a lot of Latin American influences in her music. Many of her pieces have Spanish language titles or references to instruments like what we just heard, or folklore, or narratives, or cultures. And I should mention that her interests here are really wide-ranging. She looks at Peruvian music, Spanish music, Mexican music, really kind of different settings and cultures from which to draw inspiration. Second is that Frank is really invested in this notion of music as storytelling. And she's written, there's usually a storyline behind my music, a scenario or a character. This, I think, is pretty obvious in the world of opera, but because most of her compositions have been in other genres, it's important to note that this idea of storytelling and music as a form of storytelling has been something that's been important to her even previously to her work in opera. Third is that Frank uses contrasting and varied timbres, timbre meaning sound quality, or kind of the thing that makes a piano or a flute or a violin all sound different from one another. We heard a great example of that just now, and it's something that you'll hear in the opera as well, both in the way that she uses the orchestra and in the way that she uses the voice to create really interesting and contrasting timbres in her work. And fourth is that she uses a great deal of very tonal melodies that have either an accompaniment or an atmosphere around them. So I think this is kind of related to her focus on storytelling. She wants you as the listener to be able to follow the story, follow the narrative, and know what to focus on. So in other words, this is not so much like types of contemporary music where you have various lines that are kind of crisscrossing and all seem equally important and your ear doesn't know quite where to go. Here it's usually pretty clear what you should be listening for is the most important thing in the texture of the piece, and that helps the music tell a story. So that brings us to the opera itself. And for the opera, Frank worked with the librettist Nilo Cruz. And, I think often when we talk about opera, we focus almost exclusively on the composer and really shortchange the librettist. So I want to make sure that we give ample attention to Cruz's work as well. Cruz is a Cuban-American playwright. He was born in Cuba and moved to the United States with his family when he was 9 years old to Miami. He first became involved in theater as an actor and later moved into playwriting. His kind of best-known play is Anna in the Tropics, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2003. And since then, he's gone on to write a whole vast array of works and won numerous additional awards and accolades for his work. Two of the themes that are really important and kind of resurface in Cruz's work are, one, a focus on the experience of immigrants, especially in the United States, and two, the use of magical realism. So drawing on a Latin American literary tradition of a world that is in many ways similar to our own, but also incorporates ways in which it kind of sprinklings of departure from that world that are more surreal or unexpected. This is something that will become clear in the opera as well. And the play Anna in the Tropics is actually what made Frank interested in working with Cruz. She said that when she read that play, she thought, this sounds like a libretto. This could be set to music. Just the rhythms of his language were really a natural fit for writing musical work. And the two have now been working together for over 15 years. You can see them pictured together here. And I've also included a list of just a few of the pieces that they've worked on together. These are really wide-ranging, everything for pieces for chorus and piano to pieces for soloist and orchestra, to a piece called the Conquest Requiem, which is for a huge chorus, big group of soloists, orchestra, that premiered in Houston in 2017. And throughout this partnership, they have also been thinking for a long time about writing an opera about Frida Kahlo. So this piece has been many, many years in the making. The idea for the work actually dates to 2007, when a conductor at Arizona Opera approached Frank with this idea saying, would you ever be interested in writing an opera about Frida Kahlo? And she was interested right away, but as can happen in opera, the stars did not quite align and the project didn't totally come to fruition, but it was in the back of her mind for years. She really began working on the piece with Cruz in earnest around 2015 when San Francisco, San Diego, and Fort Worth operas co-commissioned it. Then COVID unfortunately introduced further delays. So now that it is really to the stage, it's the result of many years of work that they have put into this piece, which is finally reaching us this year. So I'll give a brief synopsis now of what happens in the opera. I'm not going to give away too much because it's a new work, but I will kind of set the scene for where we are. So the opera is set in 1957, and when it opens, we're in a cemetery celebrating the Day of the Dead. And we see Diego Rivera, the muralist, on stage, walking among the worshippers who are preparing to welcome spirits back to the world. And Diego is really longing to see Frida Kahlo, his wife who has passed away 3 years prior. And In the afterlife, a character named Katrina, who is the keeper of the souls, approaches Frida and says that Diego wants her to return. Now, Frida is not so sure about this idea, and in fact, it takes a lot of kind of cajoling and convincing for her to go back to a relationship that she found quite difficult and challenging in life. But she eventually agrees to do so, and when she does, there are a few stipulations on what can happen. She'll be there for only 24 hours, as is the rule of the Day of the Dead. And she and Diego can never touch because it's a rule that the dead and the living cannot touch. So they have this opportunity to reunite, and it turns into a very kind of fraught and complex revisiting of their relationship and of their art and of what they mean to one another. And to see exactly how that pans out, you will have to see the opera. So one of the challenges that the composer and librettist faced in creating this work was that there is already so much art about Frida Kahlo. There is so much work that has been created about her life. In fact, there is so much that there's something known as Frida mania, in which she's been represented in operas, in biographies, in films, in ballets, and in all sorts of products, everything from, calendars to face masks to these cups that we see here to a children's book. There's even actually an academic book called Devouring Frida that is about just how much she's become kind of a cultural icon or symbol. So in this really crowded landscape, they faced a question, which is how would they do something new and different with her story? How would they tell a story about Frida Kahlo that hadn't before been told? And they settled on a few different premises for doing that. One was to focus on a work that was fantastical rather than biographical. So you'll notice from the synopsis that I just shared that this is not an opera that kind of starts at the beginning of Frida's life, goes through her art, and ends at the end. It's focused on this really imagined moment of encounter between the two major characters as a way to get into some of the emotional complexities that underlie their relationship. Second is this focus on the Day of the Dead. And this is actually a subject that had interested Frank for a long time, kind of separate from this project. And she mentioned that in passing one day to Nilo Cruz, the librettist, and he said, that's it. That's what we will do for our opera, is tell the story of Frida Kahlo by focusing on the Day of the Dead. So it was a real kind of collaborative decision to put their efforts there. And they also, I think, were able to create something new and distinct by using this really long-standing collaboration that they've had, drawing upon Frank's existing musical aesthetic and Cruz's work as a librettist to create a story that was really uniquely their own. So now that we've heard quite a bit about the people who created this opera, the process of making it, I want us to zoom out a little bit to a broader question, and this is about women's voices in contemporary opera. So in the introduction that I played earlier, the video of Frank speaking about herself, she told us that she's unlike other classical composers like Beethoven and like Mozart in that she's a woman, she's not white, and she's alive, which is a pretty good line. But I think that it's also a really important reminder that it is quite rare to hear opera composed by women. So I'd now like to ask everyone to just think about a question, which is, have you ever heard a performance of an opera by a female composer? And if you have, feel free to drop a response in the Q&A. So I'm not seeing any responses come in right away. Oh, I see one. Okay, Amor de Lon. Yes, I have also seen Kaya Sarayaho's opera. That's one that I've seen as well. And I think it's interesting that both of us have seen the same one. And I can tell you that, as I've been speaking to different chapters this week, at most events, there's been one or maybe two people who have heard an opera by a female composer. And in fact, the opera that was just mentioned by Sarajevo was performed, who sadly passed away last week. That piece was performed at the Met in 2016. Prior to that, the last time that they did an opera by a female composer was 1903. So they had a gap of 113 years in between those two, which is quite discouraging. So, we might think maybe there just are not a lot of operas written by women. Maybe there just aren't many to choose from. And that, in fact, is not the case. A few years ago, a group called the Women's Philharmonic Advocacy decided to create a database called 500 Operas by Women and see if they could collect that many. In fact, they found that there were even more than that. They now have almost 900 operas in this database. It really exceeded what they had even imagined was out there. And that includes work going all the way back to the year 1607 and work up to the present. So this tells us that this music is out there. Some of it is probably really excellent, and it's just not what we get to hear. It's not what companies are choosing to produce. I think it's a reminder that what we hear when we go to the opera is just a really small sliver of all the operas that have ever been written or imagined by various creators, and that there is so much more out there that we don't get to hear. So, fortunately, I think we're in a moment of sort of a paradigm shift where this is starting to change. In addition to, of course, the piece that we're speaking about tonight, there are several recent works, operas by women, that have won the Pulitzer Prize. These include Du Yun's piece Angel's Bone, which won in 2017, Ellen Reid's piece Prism, which won in 2019, and Rhiannon Giddens' Omar, which won this year and is actually coming to San Francisco next year. I just had the opportunity to see it in Boston, and it's really excellent. So exciting that it will be coming here as well. So this is part of, I think a broader trend of attention to operas by women, and that is part of several kind of interrelated changes in the world of opera. In the 2021 season, Opera America did a study of what their member companies were performing, and they found that year, about 36% of the operas that their member companies did were written after the year 1970. And this was a huge jump from a survey they'd done about 10 years before, where that number was around 5%. So there's been this real change in performing the music of living composers as well. And this doesn't just happen overnight. Groups like Opera America are creating grant programs for female composers and composers of color to make sure that they are able to do this work of creating operas and getting their work performed. Opera America has also looked at the demographics of the administrative staff of operas, so who's in the room making decisions about this music as well. And they found there that, interestingly, in terms of gender, the numbers are pretty even. In fact, women are about 60% of administrators in the opera world. With regards to race, it's a much less even number. Only about 20% of opera administrators are people of color, so still a lot of imbalance in that capacity. Going back to performing, there's also been a real shift, a kind of parallel shift in the world of orchestral music. A group called the Institute for Composer Diversity has studied changes in programming by American orchestras over just the past 7 years. And they found, as you can see here, really dramatic shifts in what music is being performed, both the music of composers of color, music by women, and in particular, in the graphic to the right, you can see that there has been a 1,425% increase in performances of music by women of color since 2015. That's a huge number, which should also kind of alert us to how low the starting point was, in addition to how kind of dramatic and exciting the increase is. So this is, I think, as I said earlier, a moment of real change across the worlds of opera and orchestral music, and one that is really exciting to see how much more music we're now going to be able to hear and engage with and appreciate. Then we get to another question, which is about how women are represented in opera. So when we go to the opera, how do we see women being portrayed on stage? Here I've included images of the final scene of two very famous operas, La Bohème and Carmen. And what we can see in this graphic is that these operas both end with women dying in really dramatic and awful ways, and singing beautifully as they do so. And this is kind of a norm, among people who study opera and opera fans too. I think it's kind of a dark joke that operas always end with women dying. Usually they did something wrong, and usually they've been made to suffer along the way as we've watched the story unfold. So this is something that has been a topic of much debate and interest among scholars of opera. Several years ago, the philosopher Catherine Clement wrote a book called Opera, or the Undoing of Women. And in this book, she argued that opera is a place where women are undone. They are harmed and assaulted and murdered with really kind of distressing frequency in these works that we know and love. And they do so to a backdrop of music that is so beautiful and so enchanting that it often kind of distracts us from really reckoning with or grappling with what we are seeing happen narratively and dramatically in the piece. So that there's this real kind of divide between what's happening musically, which is so beautiful, and these really kind of horrific stories often taking place alongside it. This is a perspective that a lot of other scholars, though, have disagreed with. For example, the scholar Carolyn Abate has argued that opera can also be seen as a site of what she calls the envoicing of women. And what she means by that is that, when you go to the opera, you usually don't see the composer in the audience. Rather, you see female performers on stage embodying these characters in ways that are often just incredibly impressive and moving and thoughtful. And Abate says that, these performers have agency of their own, narrative agency, interpretive agency. They can choose what to do with these roles, how to interpret them, so much so that they might even displace the composers who originally created and imagined these figures. So, I bring this up not so much to suggest that there is a right answer to this debate. I think there's a lot of room for nuance and complexity within it, but just to show how many different ways there are of thinking about this question of representation of women in opera and how it remains a really important site of debate in the art form. And I think this also makes it really interesting to consider what happens when we bring in someone like Frida Kahlo to the world of opera. So as I noted earlier, Kahlo has been represented across all number of different media and forms. And what happens when we then bring her into this form and its complicated history? Gabriela Lena Frank has stated that as a composer, she was really drawn to the story of Frida Kahlo, partly because she felt a sense of personal affinity with her. She writes, on a personal level, the fact that Frida is a multiracial woman of color with a disability is something I can really relate to. She lived this rich, full life that any able-bodied, non-disadvantaged person would love to be able to live. And she did so through some very dangerous times in world history. So this is already, I think, a pretty different starting point from some of these other operas that we just looked at, where you have a real sense of shared identity and experience between a female composer and a female subject for the opera. But it's extra interesting in that Frida Kahlo herself was so invested in questions of gender and self-representation as an artist in her own right. So as you might know, Frida Kahlo began painting in 1925 when she was recovering from a really traumatic bus accident that left her in lifelong pain for the rest of her life. And in the art that she created, which was mostly self-portraits, she represented herself in really complex ways, sometimes alluding to that experience of pain in her life, sometimes choosing to sidestep it. She also represented her gender self in really interesting ways. And scholars have in fact identified feminist components to a lot of her most famous paintings. You can see a few of these here. In the work on the left from 1940, we see Frida pictured wearing a suit and wearing short haircuts, so having this kind of more androgynous look to her in the painting, to kind of question how we think of the female artist being represented in the world of art. And in the other painting, which is one of her most famous works, we see her famous eyebrows. A lot of scholars have read that as kind of a playing with conventional feminine beauty standards in her work, asking people to consider the female artist from a really different perspective. And, you know, Frida's commitment to feminism extended far beyond the self-portraits that she created. She was also quite involved in feminist political movements and other progressive movements during her lifetime. So this was a commitment that extended from her art to her life as well. Kahlo's art was also a major influence for the opera. And I want to turn here to one piece that Nilo Cruz and Gabriela Elena Frank have said was particularly inspirational to them. So this piece is called The Love Embrace of the Universe, the Earth, Mexico, Myself, Diego, and Senor Zolotl. It dates from 1949. And it's a really complicated work, and I'll just point out a couple elements of interest within it. So one is that we see Frida in the center here cradling Diego Rivera, who's represented as kind of a giant baby or infant here. Frida was unable to have children herself due to her accident, and she often said that she thought of her relationship to Rivera as more like a maternal role than as one between husband and wife. We see that here, but we also see, if you look at his face, that he has this third eye, which is meant to represent his brilliance. And she said that she thought that even though their relationship was quite tumultuous and painful for her, she also thought that he was one of the most brilliant people that she'd ever met. We also see them both situated in these bigger embraces that represent their relationship to Mexican identity and culture. And that's represented in a complicated way as well. Frida is wearing this dress that's typically associated with kind of upper class Mexican society of the time, but there are also references to indigenous culture in the deity figures that we see cradling them, and in the dog who you can see who is meant to represent an Aztec figure, Zolotl, as well. And if you look, it's a little hard to see maybe in the image on screen, but if you look at Frida's face, she both has a very serene expression on her face, but also has tears dripping down her cheeks. So within all these different elements of the painting, there's this real ambivalence, this real unwillingness to accept kind of a straightforward narrative of what this relationship meant, of how she relates to Diego, to her heritage, to her nationality. All of these things are portrayed in really complicated and unsettled ways. And that is something that I think the opera dramatizes in a really powerful way. Cruz has said that he was interested in this painting. He saw it as a self-portrait that celebrates the union of the Riveras, perhaps in the afterlife, or in a more idealistic and artistic world. I don't know if I see it so much as celebratory, but I think it evokes some of the uncertainty that is at the heart of the opera. So one of the most fascinating elements of the plot, which I mentioned earlier, is that Frida is quite reluctant to return to Diego. And in fact, in the libretto, she says, "In my life, he was a demon." And she also says that she had two major accidents. One was the bus accident that devastated her physically, and the other was when she met Diego Rivera. So she's called back to him in some ways, but she's quite clear-eyed about the pain that he caused her. And I think this is really interesting in relation to more conventional representations of women in opera. Frida here is very much, she's not a passive love object or kind of passive figured at the whims of a male character. She's really a subject wrestling with her own strong emotions. And where we see that most clearly is that when Frida decides to return to the world of the living, she does so not so much to get back to Diego, but more to get back to her art. And at the beginning of Act 2, you'll see this really remarkable scene of her return. Here on this slide, you'll see on the left an image of Kahlo's famous blue house in Mexico City where she lived, which is now a museum about her life. And on the right, you'll see an early version of a set design for the opera that evokes that setting. So we really see her art taking center stage, so to speak. And, in thinking about this, I've been thinking about how it revises one of the central myths of opera as an art form. And I refer here to the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, which has been so important to composers all the way from Monteverdi to Gluck to countless composers since then. So in that myth, Orpheus travels to the underworld to rescue Eurydice, who has died. And he is the artist in the story who uses his art to facilitate that journey. What we see in this opera is Frida deciding to come out of the underworld back to the world of the living to essentially rescue Diego. And we see that they are both artists in their own right. So I think we might think of this as even kind of a feminist revision of a myth that's really central to opera's history, in which women's agency and artistry really drive the narrative of the piece. So for the final part of my talk today, I want to offer us the opportunity to listen to the work of Nilo Cruz and Gabriela Lena Frank in more depth. So this is, of course, a new opera, so we won't be listening to music from the last stream of Frida and Diego. But as I mentioned earlier, these are creators who've been working together for many years and created a variety of other exciting pieces in that time. And the piece that we're going to look at, a collaboration of theirs, is called The 5 Moons of Lorca. So this is a piece that describes the death of the playwright Federico Garcia Lorca at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. And this is a subject that had fascinated Nilo Cruz for a long time. In 2012, he actually wrote a play in which he called Lorca in a Green Dress, in which he dramatized this event. And in 2016, he and Frank were commissioned to write a choral work based on that same happening. This was a commission from the Oakland East Bay Gay Men's Chorus, and it was premiered in 2016 by that group. In 2020, they were invited by LA Opera to reimagine this piece in a different way. Now, this was during the pandemic, and as a result, it is written for a cast of performers who really reflect kind of the constraints of that moment. It's a really brief piece, about 10 minutes, so we'll get to listen to the whole thing. And it features a few new participants. And I've listed some of them here. So you'll see that there's a dancer, Irene Rodriguez, who's really at the center of the piece. There's a small chorus, there's a countertenor soloist, and piano. And this was all filmed in a way to reimagine that piece for chorus in a more dramatized setting. So I'll note before we listen to it just a few things to keep in mind as we do so. First is the use of folk song in the piece. So folk song is a subject that's been of great interest to Frank and to Cruz for a long time, It's also something that Lorca himself was very interested in. As a playwright, he actually published multiple anthologies of Spanish folk song himself. And you hear that right at the beginning. You'll hear the singer singing alone in a way that sounds almost like improvisation, lots of repeated short phrases that get gradually more complex. When the piano enters, it sounds a little bit like the strumming of a guitar. And you'll also notice that, and this I think is something quite similar to the last dream of Frida and Diego, that this is a really fantastical approach to representing historical events. The phrasing of the words in the libretto is quite elusive or elliptical, rather than a really clear-cut narrative. So that is really reflects their kind of continued interest in describing historical events through a fantastical, imaginative lens. And third and finally, this is a piece that I think is great to listen to because it really helps us think about the relevance of opera in the 21st century. So when Frank and Cruz wrote this piece, they were asked, what does this have to do with the present moment? How does it help us think about the present moment? And they both gave really different and I think really interesting answers to that question. So Cruz told us that the piece comes from his play, Lorca in a Green Dress, which takes place in what he called in that play a sort of quarantine between heaven and earth. And he says, when he saw Irene the dancer come into the mix, I saw her as a soul that is in between two levels of eternity or the afterlife. But at the same time, I saw her as someone fighting her state of being. At times she was Lorca, and at others she was a guiding spirit that was releasing him. So there's this idea of being in quarantine and being stuck. And for her part, Frank said, I think there's something to be said about political intolerance. That was the backdrop to Lorca's walk of life and the tragedy of depriving our planet of a gifted mind like this. Especially at a time when we're looking at things like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and how we are not tolerant of people who could contribute so much to our world, I think I was drawn to that story. So I think these are really valuable framing comments that help us think about opera's place in the 21st century. As you watch, you'll notice that these aren't themes that are necessarily clear or obvious from the piece itself, but they're in the mix of how the composers are thinking and how they hope the work will reach its audience in a way that I think really speaks to the enduring relevance of the art form. So we'll now listen to the piece. It's about 10 minutes long, and this is the entirety of the work. After that, there will be time for questions and comments about this and about everything that we've covered so far. So here we go. Right. So much to think about in this piece. I will now stop sharing my screen, and we're now going to move into the Q&A portion. So I will turn it over to John.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was really a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. And as Lucy mentioned, we will now shift to our Q&A. And so feel free to continue to put questions, via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm also going to invite all of our audience members to join us. And so you'll be able to join us on screen, and you can turn on your cameras, and then you could ask Lucy questions that way. So I'm just going to promote everyone to a panelist so you can join us if you wish. And then I am going to ask you a few of my own questions, Lucy, which came up for me as I was listening to you. Okay, great. Those invitations have been sent. So my first question is, you mentioned that there are a variety of influences and styles in Frank's music, and yet clearly she has her own voice as a composer. And so I'm curious how she kind of balances those two, and from your perspective, how she achieves that balance.
Yeah, that's a great question. So thinking about how a composer develops an individual voice while also being indebted to all these different influences. I think it's something that's true of all composers. Like everyone is working from a place of both seeking inspiration from others and also trying to develop something unique. I think she's kind of unusually good at telling us about it and kind of explaining what those influences are. And I think it goes back to this question of identity that I raised earlier. She's really attentive to thinking about, what it means to be writing music as a person of Peruvian and Chinese and Jewish background, and how to bring that into a Western classical tradition. So I think just by virtue of, bringing in something like the sound of the toyo, the instrument that we listened to earlier, but not necessarily, bringing that particular instrument onto the stage. Instead, she thinks about, how do I recreate that sound? How do I reimagine that sound using the string quartet? And to me, that's where the individuality comes in. It's the choices she makes in doing things like that that really allow her to develop this really individual voice that doesn't sound like anyone else. But she's also really, really good about citing her sources and kind of telling us where these ideas come from in her music.
Thank you. And another question about balance. You mentioned that the approach in this opera is a little bit more fantastical versus biographical with the relationship of Frida and Diego. And I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about that balance as well, because of course, they were married and they have a very clear biography and relationship. And so I'm just, curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think to me that's part of what is so compelling about this piece is that it takes place in this totally imagined setting, right? This world of the Day of the Dead, it takes place over only 24 hours of time. We don't see a lot of the backdrop to their relationship. We don't see what happens after. We don't see what happens kind of after this moment of reunion is over. So I think it relies on the audience knowing something or coming in with some preconceptions about what Frida and Diego were like, what their relationship was like. Because there is so much existing artwork and representation of them, I think that's a fair assumption to make of the audience about these figures. But instead of trying to, really get into Frida's mind, like what was she thinking at this moment, or how must she have felt when that happened to her, it doesn't try to do that. It doesn't try to presume that these creators can know the answers to those questions, which are really unknowable when we're talking about a real person, a real historical figure. Instead, it takes us into this world where everything is up for debate, where we can think about psychology and emotion and interaction among these two different figures in a way that lets the composer and librettist really explore that creatively, rather than kind of putting words into their mouths or kind of assuming that they would have felt a certain way about a certain situation. Instead, we're in this Day of the Dead world where kind of anything is possible.
And perhaps we see their relationship anew because of that fresh take and perspective.
Absolutely. And I think it, like, one of the things I like most about this opera is that it lets it be complicated. We don't get a sense, oh, this is how they really felt, or oh, now I know the real story. It lets some of that complexity retain its presence.
We had one more question come in, which is, if you were in the position to decide on, which operas were going to be performed at an opera house by an opera company, what would you choose, and what would be your criteria?
What a fun question. I think I would want to turn the question around, I think, and I hope this isn't a cop-out answer, but I would want to turn it around to kind of people who like to listen to operas at that opera house and kind of opera goers in that community, in that setting, and see what they wanted from opera. I know that when I've attended performances of new operas, of operas that don't get performed a lot, there's often this real sense of kind of excitement and anticipation in the theater, and a lot of audience members who say they've never been to the opera before, they've never heard anything like this before. And those to me are some of the most exciting moments as an audience member, when you can just kind of feel that buzz and excitement. So I would want to create that experience for as many people as possible. So I think I'd want to kind of turn it back to the community to see that.
I think that's a great answer. I see that Celeste and Roberta have joined us. Do you have any questions for Lucy or any comments? Just want to give you an opportunity. Yes, Roberta.
First of all, thank you so much for a really riveting presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed all of your facets on this work. I'm just, I have very limited experience with this style of dance and so on, but it kind of reminds me a bit of the trilogy that Carlos Suaro did of the of Carmen and the Blood Wedding. And I was just wondering if you were familiar with that at all. It was beautiful to see flamenco style dance portraying a story like that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question. I wish I knew more about that. What I do know is that Irene Rodriguez, the dancer who is featured in this piece, is a Cuban dancer who has worked extensively in the flamenco tradition, and that the creators immediately thought of her as someone who could kind of bring Lorca's story to life. So I can see why you would see the parallels to something like Blood Wedding, another work by Lorca, and kind of thinking about that. I think that there's a way in which this piece was likely inspired by all sorts of other works that they saw. And I would be curious to know kind of what the creators and dancers were listening to and watching and thinking of as they created this piece. I don't know if the work that you mentioned was a specific point of reference, but I can imagine that it might have been.
Thank you. And did you have a question or comment, Cece?
I have a comment. I just want to say thank you for a terrific presentation. This was very wonderful and inspiring. It's great to see women in the art, and I'm looking forward to this opera, not only because it's composed by a woman and women from the Bay Area, but because it's featuring the Mexican culture, and I'm Mexican, and I'm very excited to have learned all these components of the opera today. And what I find more inspiring, or like just warming is the fact that she finds common ground in other music genres and in sounds around the world and brings them into a masterpiece. Sometimes we always want to be different, or we want to find the exciting new thing, when as cultures and as humans, we vibrate just by being humans with other humans, and we have so much in common. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful way to put it, and I think exactly what she's trying to do in her music, kind of create these points of affinity and discovery and exploration among all these different cultures. So yeah, I hope you enjoy seeing the opera. I'm really excited about it too.
Well, thank you again. And we are just about at the end of our time. So I'm just going to say that this virtual preview is being recorded, and it is available to stream on demand through the run of the opera, which is through June 30th. And I will put the link in the chat. It is sfopera.com/opera previews. That will take you to the place you need to go to register to view the recording. And I will turn it over to Peggy Hill and Benjamin to close things out for us.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on, this is our last preview of the 22-23 season. And by the way, if you can't get to the Opera House, all the 3 operas for this summer can be live streamed. Madame Butterfly is tomorrow night at 7:30. Just you need to get on the San Francisco website and sign up, $27.50, and you can watch at home. And then Die Frau, the Richard Strauss opera, is Tuesday, June 20th at 7 p.m. and Frida y Diego, Thursday, June 22nd at 7:30 p.m. And you also, there are replays available, so you can watch it up to say like 48 hours after the actual live stream. And again, thank you for joining us. Hope to see you again next year when for the next opera season, we'll be doing the previews again, both live around throughout the Bay Area and on virtual. And now for the final words for this season, Benjamin Osgood.
Thank you, Peggy. This was a fun season, and it was so great to bring so many new perspectives. And I think this preview was especially special because, you know, Lucy, you did such a beautiful job of bringing to the surface what makes this art form so special and why this time in history is so special. We're hearing voices from people that have never been heard but have always existed. And it's just so exciting to be able to be a part and see these productions and to gain these different perspectives from things that are unfamiliar usually in the opera world. And Celeste, I thought that was a beautiful comment that you had, in that, as different as we all are, this art also showcases and spotlights our commonality and our vibration, as you said. And great comments from Roberta as well. And this was just really wonderful. So it was a wonderful season. And thank you, Lucy. Obviously, thank you to John and Peggy. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone in the next season. And I'm ready to go to the opera. And these previews make it extra special when we go and enjoy this art and take it in. And thank you, Lucy, for bringing this perspective to this art form. So from the San Francisco Opera Guild and the San Francisco Opera, we wish you a wonderful night, and we look forward to seeing you next season. Thank you.